Good evening. So tonight we are in Job. We'll be going 35 through 37, maybe a little bit more, but we'll see how that goes. Usually my optimism doesn't pay off in this situation. I usually don't make it quite as far as I plan, but likely we'll have maybe 1 or 2 more weeks in the book of Job before we finish out the book. So that's at least my plan for the moment. We're in Job chapter 35, but just leading up to this, we're in the Discourse of Laihu. Job's friends, they had an outlook that Job was guilty, and they knew it because of how the Lord dealt with him. Laihu has a modified position of that idea of retribution, so he is close, but there are a few assumptions he makes. Is what he's saying is God has caused this to happen to expose a sin that you have in you. So instead of it being because you are sinning, this happened, like God always punishes the wicked, what he's saying is he caused this to happen to expose a sin in you in order to correct it. And so which is modified retribution. In a sense, that's really what he's going at. So it's a take, and it's not an accurate take, because that's not why God is doing it. So Laihu, in fact, I agree with him mostly. There's a few assumptions, and in fact, probably if I didn't know about the assumptions, I would probably agree with him completely. But since I know this is not what God is doing, then we can look at his speech in the light of what he's really saying. And it's interesting, you think about that as you can really see the way this book sheds light on truth in saying things that you want to agree with, but you know otherwise. And it also helps expose in yourself, maybe I'm more along this line of thinking than Job's friend's line of thinking. So just by way of review, in chapter 32, Laihu basically makes his case why he should address the elders that were speaking already. He says, you guys are not answering what needs to be answered. And even though I'm younger than you, I'm going to answer, because you would assume with age comes wisdom, but that's not always true. But God is the giver of wisdom, and even though I'm young, I have a spirit of wisdom that God gave me. So that's basically his argument. And so he's very politely and diplomatically excusing himself and also taking the floor on the conversation a little bit. Completely, not a little bit. He's just taking the floor, but he's doing it in a very diplomatic way. In chapter 33, his main point is God is the corrector of man. God is the one who chooses punishment, who does what is right in his eyes. Man does not correct God. God corrects man. If you look with me in 33 verses 29 through 30, kind of a central statement in this is 33:29. Behold, God does all these oftentimes with men, to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may enlighten, so that he may be enlightened with the light of life. So essentially he makes this case, he talks about all different things, but really what he's saying is God is the corrector of man. And now this is an appropriate correction to Job, because although everyone in the story has problems with their thinking. And so Elihu's modifying, but still taking a position of retribution, where Job is, he turned to self-righteousness. I know I'm innocent, but I'm suffering anyway. I want to make my case before God, because it seems to me that he's being unjust in my case. So there's a self-righteousness about that. And in fact, Laihu is really close to the target, because this is exactly what God corrects Job for when God speaks. So Elihu's correction of Job and God's correction of Job are very similar, except for the assumptions and the explanation Elihu gives goes a little further than what God would go. So that's chapter 33. Chapter 34, he addresses another aspect of what Job said, and Job makes the claim, Is God just? Does he care about the affairs of men? Is he indifferent to what happens? Because what's happening to me is unjust. So therefore, God must be unjust. So Job made these arguments, and he talked about it in a variety of ways. So here Laihu is keying into that. And if we look in chapter 33 and verses 5 and 6, he says, "For Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my right. Should I lie concerning my right? My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression." So here you see Job, he's addressing this claim that Job made, that although I am righteous, I am being wounded by God. And so Job's assumption is this is some form of punishment coming upon me from God, even though I am righteous. So the assumption of a punishment, which is the assumption of retribution, this is Job is thinking on their lines too, but just from a slightly different angle. But he, instead of maybe yielding to God, he is taking a stand against God, holding up himself as an example. And he's not wrong in the fact that he's righteous, but he is wrong in the assumption he's making about God. Look in verse 12. "Surely God will not act wickedly, and the Almighty will not pervert justice." So here's Elihu's, part of what Elihu's saying is God's not going to act wickedly and pervert justice. So you might claim that, but he isn't doing that. And that's true. Laihu really was wise about God in a lot of ways. And he's like, God will not pervert justice. So if this is a punishment, it's because you earned it, not because he's perverting justice. So there you see there's the underlying assumption again, but that's going to be his counter-argument in that. Look in verse 21 and 22. "For his eyes are upon the ways of man, and sees all his steps." Here, Laihu's making the point that God can't be unjust in his reasoning because he doesn't have to guess about anything. When God looks at man, he knows exactly what man is doing, and if he deals out retribution, it's exactly right for what a man deserves, which is true about God. God does see that, and God isn't going to pervert justice because he knows there's like men. Sometimes, you get stories or whatever about innocent men being on death row because there was some evidence or misunderstanding of evidence, or the whole circumstance wasn't known. But you have an innocent guy on death row. God doesn't make that kind of mistake. That's what Elihu's saying, is God doesn't have oversights. God doesn't miss something. He can see what men do, and he knows. So God will not be unjust in his decisions. One more. No, we got two more here. So 33. So chapter 34, verse 33. "Shall he recompense on your terms because you have rejected it?" So now here's the point where Job is saying, God's wrong. I want to make my case. He's like, God doesn't pervert justice, and he doesn't owe you anything. Do you think just because you throw a fit that God's going to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, would you please tell me your grievance"? Have you ever seen that the complaint thing where it's like a hand grenade with the pin and it has a little number on it and it says, "Have complaints, take a number," right? And so the idea is you pull the pin out of the grenade. That's kind of the idea, right? Is I don't care about your complaint is really what that says. And that's kind of the same thing Elihu's saying is God doesn't need to hear your complaints. Just because you disagree with him doesn't mean he's not right and not greater than you. And so he's correcting Job on that point. And I think that's a fair correction as well. And the last one, verses 35 through 37, he says, "Job speaks without knowledge, and his words are without wisdom. Job ought to be tried to the limit, because he answers like wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin, and he claps his hands among us, and multiplies his words against God." So here you have a strong rebuke of Job's claim of righteousness in the face of God. So he's saying, I want to go to God and make my case that I am righteous, that he's mistaken, that I did not deserve this. Now, he didn't deserve it. But I think that in this next chapter, we're going to see Elihu make a case about how man looks to God to take him out of a situation instead of looking to God to help him through a situation. I think, that's Job is here looking to God to take him out of a situation because it's unjust, where Laihu says men ought to recognize God as their maker, not as someone who's going to set the record straight or get them out of a bad situation that they don't deserve. So, but this is, we get a summary of Laihu's corrections of Job, and he's pretty well on target in the way he corrects Job. Job was wrong, whether he's in pain saying it or whether he's in despair or whatever else. It is wrong to question God's justice because of your circumstances. And that's a problem that a lot of people have, is they judge God according to their experience. I did a lesson, I don't know if I've done it here, but I did a lesson and it was about trusting God. And there's a couple of ways that people trust. There's a way of trust which is, it's basically an exchange. You do this and I'll do that. And if you don't do this, then I won't do that. Like it's kind of the business kind of trust, right? As long as someone pays you, you continue extending credit to them. But when they stop paying you, you stop extending credit. It's conditional sense of trust. And then there's a trust that comes along with, I trust you because I know your character. So this is more what in a marriage, right? So even if someone acts in a way that is a violation of trust, your confidence in their character, and that was actually acting outside of who I know you to be, you continue to trust them even though they've gone against trust because you have confidence in their character. So that is a lot of times how we trust God. But what if what you know to be God's character is based on a false assumption because you're defining God by your experiences instead of by how He defines Himself? So then, I know God doesn't want me to suffer. Let's just put that one. That's what a lot of people say. God wants me to be happy. That's who God is. He wants me to be happy. Now this unhappy circumstance happens when in a marriage you trust someone on that, but when someone violates their character to the extent where it's a betrayal, where it's perceived as a betrayal, like adultery in marriage or that sort of a thing, now your disposition shifts where it's harder to gain trust back because now I don't trust your character. You have violated what I knew your character to be, and you've misrepresented that to me. So now I don't trust you, and I never will trust you. So one is, just kind of in trade, but when you violate that belief in the character, it's a lot harder to restore that kind of a betrayal. So if you define God's character, and then He betrays what you think His character is, you're going to have a lot harder time trusting Him again, not based on who He is, but based on who you defined Him as. And so that's kind of what you see here is if you start defining God's character through your experiences, then you end up in a spot where you feel God has betrayed you and violated you because I believed you to be this way, and that's not who you were. So that's what will happen a lot of times when people fall away from God, is they will define Him on their own terms, and when that falls through, then they believe God betrayed them, and they'll blame God for it instead of correcting themselves and saying, look, I didn't realize who God was. So that's kind of what we see going on here, is they're redefining God. So Job, he had an idea of who God was supposed to be, and God didn't act that way. So that's you see the response is, I want to make my case against you because you've betrayed me. You've did not act according to what I think you should. And so this correction here, when we see God correct Job, He's going to set the record straight and say, I never told you I was that. This is who I am. And then Job's like, okay, I'll go with that. So he is correctable, and Job's friends are correctable, and in fact at the end of the chapter, or at the end of the book. So in 35, Laihu takes his third speech and This is addressing Job's self-righteousness directly. So he's going to correct Job in his self-righteousness. So we'll just go and begin 35 verse 1. Then Laihu continued and said, do you think this is according to justice? Do you say my righteousness is more than God's? For you say, what advantage will it be to you? What profit will I have more than if I had sinned? I will answer you and your friends with you. So here's what Laihu's saying is, you say my righteousness is more than God's. And then you say, what benefit is it to be righteous if he deals with righteous people and sinners the same way? So Job is saying, God has violated my trust. He has violated who I thought he was, because I expected if I turn to him, and really Job is feeling like God is not answering him. He's not forgiving him. He says, if I've sinned, I repent. Like I've worked to not be on bad terms with you. And if after all that work, you still treat me as if I'm your enemy, you still turn your back on me, you still refuse to answer me and strike at me like this, he's like, what benefit is it for being righteous over being a sinner? That's what he's asking about this. And it's because he feels like God has let him down. And so, but that thought process, I think Elihu's calling it out right, is you start thinking that way, and what you really are saying is, my definition of righteousness is better than yours. And this was wrong for Job to do. This is one of the ways that Job spoke wrong, and his friend picked up on that, and in fact was infuriated by it, and so he's going to answer that complaint to God, or complaint about God. So we're going to look at verse 6 here. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish? Oh, I want to back up. Verse 5. Look at the heavens and see, and behold the clouds, they are higher than you. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are many, what do you do to him? If you are righteous, what do you give him? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness is for a man like yourself, and your righteousness for a son of man. So here what he's saying is, whether or not you're wicked or righteous has no bearing on who God is. He's really saying, if the clouds are higher than you, if you can't even rise above the clouds, how are you going to rise above God? How are you going to elevate your righteousness somehow above God's righteousness? What you do, whether right or wrong, does not affect God. And so the idea is not that God doesn't care, but it has no bearing on who he is. So for him to say, my righteousness should have changed his mind somehow, or my wickedness should change his mind somehow, Elihu's just saying that's not how it works. God's higher than you. He's wiser than you. He's truer in his sense than you are. And so making that claim is a self-righteous claim. So that's the beginning of it. You're making a self-righteous claim. Look in verse 10. But no one says, so he's saying now people cry out when people suffer, they cry out to God. In verse 8 it says, your wickedness is for a man like, verse 9. Because of the multitude of oppression, they cry out. They cry out for help because of the arm of the mighty. But no one says, where is God my maker, who gives me songs in the night, who teaches us more than the beasts of the earth and makes us wiser than the birds of the heaven. So here's kind of an interesting saying. It's a kind of a poetic way of saying this. But no one in the midst of adversity says, where is the God who brings me joy in adversity? Where's my maker? Where's the one who created me and has made me, makes me able to have joy in the midst of adversity? Where's the God who has created me with intellect and a higher thinking and an ability to reason beyond animals, where I can correct my ways and change? Where's God in that? Is that we cry out, deliver me from this. We don't cry out, help me through this. I just think it's kind of an interesting contrast that Elihu draws out here, is the idea of demanding God take me out versus a cry to God to bring me through. the adversity. That's really kind of the thought tied up in this. And then he goes on to say, verses... I'll just start reading in verse 12. There they cry out, but he does not answer because of the pride of evil men. He's saying, when you demand that God take you out of a bad situation, whether or not it's you created it or not, when you start demanding that, it exposes a pride in your heart. An unwillingness to yield to what God has, to where God has allowed you to be. It's just he's saying that that exposes a pride in the heart. Let's talk about this for a minute, because I think there's some good application we can draw from this. Look with me in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 8. Here is a sort of a practical application of this concept. In 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians 12, verse 8, here Paul is talking about his thorn in the flesh. It says, "Concerning this I implored the Lord 3 times that it might leave me. And he said to me, My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I would rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weakness, with insults, with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong." So here, and in verse 7, it says, God gave me a thorn of the flesh to keep me from exalting myself. But what did Paul do? Remove it from me. Take me out of this situation. That, according to Laihu, exposes some of Paul's pride. Instead of accepting what the Lord had done for him, he was fighting against it. He was asking God, take me out of this situation. What was God's answer to him? Well, not quite. Not quite. It was the answer Job wished he had, in a sense. My power is perfected in weakness. My grace is sufficient for you. All you need to know is that I will be with you as a help while you suffer through this pain, through this challenge, whatever it happens to be. No one can say quite what the thorn in the flesh was. It could be some health thing, or possibly, when God called him, he said, I'm going to show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. Maybe Paul knew all the suffering that was in his near future for the sake of Christ. And whatever it happened to be, whether it was the upcoming suffering he wanted to avoid, or whether it was an ongoing health problem or something to that effect, Paul was saying, I can serve you better without it. And Jesus says, no, you can't. And so what does Paul do? With that information, my grace is sufficient. He accepts it. That's exactly right. He says, I'm exactly where the Lord wants me to be, and I am happy with that.
Where do you think the power was manifested? Who saw the power? The people that he was preaching to and other brethren or other apostles? Or he says power is perfected in weakness. People saw the weakness, but they must have seen the power as well.
Yeah, so just when I was growing up, the preacher at our church, his best friend I think his name was Steve, and he died of melanoma. But all the way up until the end of his life, he would teach in the church. And there came a point where he had to sit in a chair, and he was so weak, but he would still put in the effort and teach and be involved with the congregation. And they always talked about how moving it was to see this man serve God to the end of his life, even though he was suffering so much. So who benefited from that? It's just, you see that dedication, you see someone doing so much with so many hurdles to overcome, and it's impressive. It's always impressive, right? Everybody, we like the underdog stories. We like the stories about people who lose limbs and go on to win championships, or people who face a major adversity and then overcome it and just succeed exceptionally. Like, that is inspiring to us. But also just that willingness to yield to the will of Christ, yield to the will of God. There's something impressive about that as well. And so I think that probably there's several ways in that, but the reality, what it really comes down to is, am I willing to trust God? And that's Laihu is kind of getting at that, is, are you willing to trust God? Are you willing to accept where the Lord has put you and follow Him through the adversity? You had a thought, Jim?
It just reminds me of the way that the Jews responded to the apostles when they were preaching in the synagogue or in the temple. They said, these are uneducated men. How are they speaking like this? And so God's power was shown or made complete by the weakness of the men who were bringing the message.
Or even Jesus, right? How is He so learned having never been educated? As they said that, in a lot of ways you see that. And 1 Corinthians 2 even, now you got me on a roll. 1 Corinthians 2, 1 and 2, it says, God chose the weak things and the foolish things to manifest His power, so that through those things the wise and the powerful would be humiliated. And so God chose that, and so that a lot of times that was His approach. So the first one we see is it's just a practical application, right? Of Laihu says, people come to God and say, get me out of this situation. They don't say, Lord, give me a song in the night. Help me sing through this. Help me have that joy when I'm going through this. Help me to find ways to rejoice in You. You've made me. You've made me capable. You've provided for me in this situation. I want to look at another scripture, 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 11. This is along the same lines. It says, let me make sure it's 1 Peter 3:13. Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts always, being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account of the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. And keep a good conscience, so that in the thing which you are slandered, those who see your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. For it is better if God should will it so, that you should suffer for doing what is right, rather than for doing what is wrong. And then it goes on and makes a comparison to Christ. But here again, you look at the thing. It says, don't say, get me out of this trouble. It says, do the right thing and be happy to give an account. Why am I willing to go through hard things for my hope? Why are you willing to do that? When someone says, why? You could have it easier. Yeah, but I have a hope in Jesus. I've been saved. This life means nothing to me anymore because I have something better. So if I'm suffering for a little while, I'm happy to do that because this is nothing. And that's what Paul would say is, I count the suffering of this life as to be not worthy to be compared to the glory that is to come. He says this over and over again, that the Lord brings him through. And so what we're seeing is, what we find out in Christianity and in through Christ is kind of this limited conclusion that Laihu draws is really drawn out in Christian faith. And this is the way of life for Christian faith. You don't have to have good life. What you have to do is be faithful to God, and you can be satisfied with that. You can have joy in that. You can have joy in suffering. You can have comfort in hardship. And it's not because God takes you out of it, but because God is with you through it. And that's the key, is God is with you through it. And so we turn to God for strength, for help, and for comfort. And I'm not going to read these, but just, you turn to God for strength. Philippians 4:11 through 14. Paul says, I've learned to be content in every circumstance, and I'm well content with suffering, with hardships, with starving, because I've learned to be poor and I've learned to be wealthy, because I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And he just says, I'm content to have my God. And Paul says, everything else I can get through as long as I have my God. So he's a God who gives us strength. Hebrews 4:16. Since we have confident access to the throne of God by the blood of Christ, we can approach Him. Since by the blood of Christ we have confident access to the throne of God, we can approach Him in our time of help, time of need, to get help. So God is the God of help. In 2 Corinthians 1:3-4 talks about He's the God of all comfort, who comforts the afflicted. And so in all of this, what we see is God doesn't take us out of the suffering. He gives us comfort, and He walks with us through the suffering, which is a much better blessing. Because not only do you know you're okay through the suffering, but it also enables you, as 1 Corinthians or 2 Corinthians 1:3-4 says, it says, then you're able to go and comfort someone else. So now it's not just God walking with someone through the suffering, it's God and His faithful servants walking with that person through the suffering. And you're able to give comfort because you can identify with that pain. You've been through that and you've seen the good that comes from it. So in all this, what we really just note that, Laihu's on track. He said, in Job, that's where Job needs to put his mind is don't take me out of it, but bless the Maker who can give you joy in these times and who has given you a mind to understand more. And then ultimately, that's what we do is we understand, even in the pain, we can reason that God's in here with us, that He's our support, He's our help, He walks through it with us. Now in Job 35:14, it says, how much less when you say you do not behold Him, the case is before Him and you must wait for Him. And now because He has not visited in His anger, nor has He acknowledged transgression as well, so Job opens his mouth emptily and multiplies words without knowledge. So here he's saying, because you demanded God to give an answer and He doesn't answer you, you have spoken foolishly. And really this is the final rebuke of Job's self-righteousness, that my righteousness is greater than God's. And I would like to make my case before God. And I think this is a fair correction of Job. It is a fair correction of Job. Any thoughts or comments on that before we move on?
But just one idea, and when we get to the end of the book, the only one that is not required to offer a sacrifice is Elihu. And I think that's significant. The other three knuckleheads, and Job offered the sacrifice for them as their high priest. Elihu wasn't required by God to do that.
Yeah, and
he was much more on track than the others.
And I think his friends were a little disingenuous in what they were doing. They weren't listening to correction. Elihu, he, I like your way of saying it better. Yeah. He was honest and sincere in what he said, and I think what he said showed wisdom and insight. I think that's right. As he was on track, and God even takes almost verbatim a thing that Elihu says and says it himself. So multiple times actually. And I believe it's this multiplying words without knowledge is what God's accusation of Job is in 38 and 40 and 42, I believe. That same thing comes up multiple times. In chapter 36, Laihu he defends God. Now he's bringing up, here's why God did what He did. So here's where he gets a little off track in his reasoning and starts bringing up the idea of retribution in his argument here. Look down in verse 5, 36 verse 5. Behold, God is mighty, but does not despise any. He is mighty in strength and of understanding. He does not keep the wicked alive, but gives justice to the afflicted. So here, he shifts a little bit, and he says what the other guys were saying. The wicked die, the righteous live and prosper. So here he asserts that I don't know that he can defend it, but he's at least betraying to some extent his thinking, and there's an underlying problem in his reasoning system. And I think that leads him to bring it around to retribution and to assume bad things happen to people who do bad things. And Job's argument against that is, then why don't bad things happen to people who do bad things? If that's how it is, then why isn't it that way? And Laihu, he doesn't... you really messed me up, Bruce, by doing that to me. I got to go with So he really brings that back around and goes down that road too, because it was a common thought of the day, and they're being called to rise above it, I think, or we're being called to rise above it. So, but it's being exposed here. So, verse 6: He does not keep the wicked alive, but he gives justice to the afflicted. And then starting in 7, he does not withdraw his eye from the righteous, but with kings on a throne he has seated them forever, and they are exalted. And if they are bound in fetters, and are caught in cords of affliction, then he declares to them their work, and their transgressions, that they might have magnified themselves. He opens their ears to instruction, and commands that they return from evil. So here he's saying, he's giving the retribution, he repeats what they say, but then he gives a modifier. But there might be some righteous people who are afflicted. But they're afflicted because God is exposing a character flaw that they need to correct. So now what he's doing is he's preemptive. He's bringing about hard circumstances that's going to expose how you're unrighteous so you can be corrected. I don't know that this is too far off. I think some of the assumptions in it are wrong. But, we see in Hebrews, it talks about how God's like a loving father who disciplines his children. And the discipline he's talking about is Christians going through suffering in order to improve their disposition. But I think the difference is you could have someone who doesn't have a character flaw. We're not exposing a character flaw. Discipline is a training, right? And so you may be weak, you may be immature, and you need to become more mature, but that's the natural progression of age and life, is you should be becoming more mature. And that doesn't mean you have an inherent character flaw. So if God puts you in a position that causes you to mature, that's discipline. It's not punishment. And I think what Laihu is getting around to saying is he preemptively almost makes you sin in order to correct it. He puts you in a position where your weaknesses will be exposed and you're going to draw it out. So I think it's a mild distinction, but I do think that what he's drawing out is he is causing a flaw to be exposed so he can correct you versus a growth thing. It's a causing transgression thing. So I think there's a mild difference, but it is in the wheelhouse of retribution and is off track for that reason. So he declares their work to him. In verse 10, he opens their ears to instruction and commands that they return from evil. If they hear and serve him, they will end their days in prosperity and their years in pleasure. But if they do not hear, they shall perish by the sword, and they will die without knowledge. So here, I know it seems like a small distinction, because I believe that God disciplines us in order to help us to mature. But here it's more about exposing a transgression and putting you at a crossroads. You either do the wrong thing and die, or you do the right thing and you're restored. But here the idea of you will always be rewarded for doing good and punished for doing bad is the same thing. And now you have maybe a violation. God does not tempt anyone, where it seems like Laihu saying he puts you in a position of temptation in order to cause you to expose your sin and then see if you're going to go with the sin or take correction. So I think it sounds like a mild distinction, but there is definitely a distinction, and it relates back to the retribution idea, which is wrong. And there's two reasons why. Going back over this is, one, it said Job was righteous. The second one is, how would it work on Jesus? Right? If Jesus goes through affliction, is God doing it to expose an inherent weakness in him in order to find out if he needs to punish him for it or correct him? So, what? Neither, right? Now, Jesus went through those trials, and it says he was perfected in them. Kind of an interesting thing, but he matured, right? He never was immature, but he demonstrated the quality by going through the hardship without sin. He was, but it says he was perfected through his suffering in Hebrews. But this idea of he demonstrated what was seen in his character was revealed through suffering. But it was revealing the good in him through suffering. And I think that's likely, it seems to me, seems in Scripture, God is an optimist concerning people. He looks at them, he sees their good potential, and he trusts that they'll do the right thing when he puts them in a situation. He puts them in a situation in order to succeed, not to fail. And maybe that's a good way of saying it, is to say what Laihu's saying is he put you in a position to fail so that he might correct you, versus he put you in a position that he knew you could succeed in. And if you fail, that is on you, that's not on God. So maybe that's a better way to frame it. So look in verse 15 and 16. It says, he delivers the afflicted in their affliction and opens their ears in a time of oppression. Then indeed he enticed you from the mouth of distress. Instead of it, a broad place with a constraint, and that is what... This is not what I was looking for. Let me... This note is, I'm just going to, I know why. I was looking at 35. All right, we gotta stay in 36. All right, 22 and 20 through 26 is what I wanted to look at. 22 through 26. Behold, God is exalted in his power. Who is a teacher like him? Who has appointed him in his way? And who has said, you have done wrong? Remember that you should exalt his work, of which men have sung. All men have seen it. Man beholds from afar. Behold, God is exalted, and we do not know him. The number of his years is unsearchable. So here, what we see Laihu saying is, to say you want to make a case against God, you have to understand God. And what he's saying is, God is unsearchable. To say you have wisdom he doesn't have, or you have an insight he doesn't have, or you have a correction that he needs, is a ridiculous thing to say, because you don't know the smallest part about God. So Laihu is, in a way, saying what Job said. Job described all these great things and said this is the very fringe of his power. And Laihu's reasserting that same thing, is God is so great and so powerful, you can't even understand the smallest things of what he does, the drops of rain and things like that. How can you presume to make a correction against him? So here Laihu gets back on track, and this is the very argument God makes. All he says is, Job, I want you to tell me a few things. How does rain work? Where do I keep the snow? Where do I keep the hail? Why are animals this way? Why do they behave in this way? Why can't you overcome the small things that I've done with all your wisdom? And Job can't answer that. And so this is, Laihu goes down the same path of reasoning, and he's not off base from what God said. So behold, God is exalted, and we do not know him. The number of his years is unsearchable. It's just the idea of God's wisdom is just far beyond our own. And now you think about Laihu, from his perspective, he was shy about speaking up in the presence of aged men. Now God's years are unsearchable. Who would speak up in the presence of God? You know, this is consistent with Laihu's character as well, because he was already respectful. Even when the aged men he was listening to were wrong and it was making him angry, he listened silently and waited his turn. How much more in the presence of God? So I just think this is a good way to put that, and also appreciate it from the mouth of Laihu, and it's completely consistent with his quality, with his way of respect and his quality upbringing. Chapter 37. Here Laihu brings up God's power, who God is, and just honors the strength of God is really the idea. He's just honoring the strength of God. But almost the way I want to read this, I don't know if this is true or not, but it seems like it could be, just because he starts talking about a storm and then God answers Job from a whirlwind. So these two chapters blend together a little bit in context, at least, because 37:1 it says, "At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Listen closely to the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that goes out from his mouth." It's almost like they're in the house and a storm's coming, and as Elihu's giving his speech, there's a flash of lightning, and then the ground is shaking. He's just, listen to the voice of God. Listen how scary it is. I mean, how powerful the voice of it. It's almost like he just like Jesus. He's in a field and he says, it's like a sower went out to sow. Maybe Elihu's in a thunderstorm saying, God's voice is like this thunder you're hearing and lightning, and he just talks about the thunder and lightning over and over in this. I don't know if that's true, but that's at least how I like to imagine it, to kind of help me put me in the eyes of what's going on here. At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Listen closely to the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that goes out from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it loose, and his lightning to the ends of the earth. After it a voice roars. He thunders with a majestic voice, and he does not restrain the lightning when his voice is heard. God thunders with his voice wondrously, doing great things which we cannot comprehend. For to the snow he says, fall on the earth, and to the downpour and the rain, be strong. He seals the hand of every man, that all men may know his work. Then the beasts go into their lair and remain in its den. Out of the south comes the storm, and out of the north the cold. From the breath of God ice is made, and the expanse of the water is frozen. Also with moisture he loads the thick cloud. He disperses the cloud of his lightning. It changes direction, turning around by his guidance, that it may do whatever he commands it on the face of the inhabited earth. Whether for correction, or for his world, or for loving kindness, he causes it to happen. So you just see is God is the one who causes the storm. The lightning, the rain, the hail, the cold wind, it's his breath, and everything he says, it's something we have absolutely no control over, but then God has intimate control over. That's the idea, is God has complete control over all these things. We can't even begin to imagine to control it. And then he says, we don't know why God does it. It's either for his for correction, or his world, water the ground, for loving kindness, to help somebody out. But he causes it to happen. We don't know his reason. We just can see what God does. And then he goes on, corrects Job. Listen to this, O Job. Stand and consider the wonders of God. Do you know how God establishes them, makes the lightning of his clouds to shine? Do you know about the layers of the thick clouds, the wonders of the one who perfected knowledge? You whose garments are hot when the land is still because of the south wind. Can you, with him, spread the skies strong as a molten mirror? Teach us what we shall say to him. We cannot arrange our case because of darkness. Shall it be told to him that I would speak? Or should a man say that he would be swallowed up? Now men do not see the light which is bright in the skies, but the wind has passed and cleared them. Out of the north comes the golden splendor. Around God is awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. And he is exalted in power, and he will not do violence to justice. And abundant righteousness. Therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who is wise of heart. And really, here's his way of, kind of the mini way of saying what God says in the next chapter. you can't understand the smallest things of what God does. How are you going to tell us? And what he says is, are you the one who's going to instruct me to speak in the presence of God? He's not willing, Laihu's not willing to take that bet. He's like, I won't do that. I'm not going to follow you in that, Job. You're on your own in going and confronting God. And so in the end here, he brings up this good point. And just, I want to go into 38. Just read the first couple verses. It says, Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens counsels by words without knowledge? And so he's like, who have I heard is multiplying words about me, not even knowing what they're talking about? Who's darkening counsel by words without knowledge? And that's exactly what Laihu said about him. So here God vindicates Laihu in his assessment of Job and the way he acted. And then God, in verse 3, Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. That would be intimidating. And just imagine, Laihu is talking, there's thunder, and then you're hearing the thunder, and he's saying how mighty is the voice of God, how, powerful is his lightning, and he speaks in the thunder, and all these things, right, and the wind, and all, and then he challenges Job, and then you hear, and Job steps outside and hears this whirlwind, and God's like, who is it that darkens counsel by multiplying words without knowledge? And you just see that as soon as this is done, maybe he steps out in the storm, and God is outside speaking with a voice like thunder, asking Job, he's approaching Job in a way, like Job said, right, is, I want God to stand before me in a way that I won't tremble. Well, here he's got it. Right? This is as low a volume, as lower power that God can get is this tornado. Something like that outside the house that Job has to go stand in front of and listen to the thunder of God speaking to him and saying, now you answer me, you instruct me, and I'm going to listen to you. So all of a sudden, Job doesn't feel as tough as he once did. So that's what we'll pick up in next week. Any thoughts or comments before we close up for tonight? All right, if not, let's close with a word of prayer.